Are we recording? I think we're recording video. Since we're recording video, let's start talking about underwater video. So this video tutorial is going to talk about underwater video 101. So all the basics you need to know to get started shooting underwater video, whether you're just beginning or you're thinking about taking that first step. So let's get started. In my mind, there's 3 different approaches to shooting underwater video, and actually 4, because there's always an approach, which means you don't really know what you're doing, you're just hitting that red button sometimes just because you're like, whoa, okay, let's hit the red button. So with that not in mind, we've got just 3 approaches. So the first for underwater video is if you just want a couple clips to share on social media or show someone what it's like to dive with a certain subject. Maybe you're swimming with a whale or a manta and you just want to show someone exactly what it's like wow, this is that experience. After that, you start looking at wanting to produce more of an underwater film, which is putting some clips together into a long form video or short form, but just composed of multiple clips. And then that's a slightly different mentality. And within that, there's 2 different versions. One is where you storyboard the film up front. So maybe you want to put together a video about your dive trip. You've got some travel scenes as you're leaving home and getting to the resort. Then you've got some establishing shots topside at the resort. And then you start working your way underwater into those underwater video shots. The other way is if you just run and gun and shoot everything, and then you get home with a hard drive full of video, and now you sit down and edit and try and see what kind of story you want to put together. So with those 3 things in mind, one is just clips, one is with storyboard type of video, and the other is just running, gunning, and shooting everything and figuring it out later. So with all 3 of those different shooting styles, we're gonna still rely on basic video settings. There are a number of different basic video settings, and all of them can work to serve different purposes. But in general, there's a few basics. First, I like to shoot at full HD resolution. And what that means is I'm shooting at 1920 by 1080 pixels. And that's full HD. It's what's going to be shown on an HD monitor or an HD television or HD on YouTube, Vimeo, Facebook, wherever you're showing your videos. So it's pretty standard. We hear a lot of talk about 4K and above in terms of resolution. And generally our monitors, our TVs aren't really showing 4K at this point. Yes, Vimeo and YouTube will stream some 4K, but in all practical purposes, we're not using 4K that much. As a matter of fact, a lot of people shooting in 4K are actually rendering the video down to full HD or less so that they can edit it, because it's a beast of a file for your computer to chug through and try and edit. So a lot of those 4K videos will be down-resed, so into a lower resolution that then the videographer can edit or the editor can edit, and then they'll up-res it when they're exporting and finished editing and then upload the 4K. Because it's just such a large file, it's hard to deal with. With all those things in mind, I like to shoot at full HD, 1920 by 1080. You've got the best resolution and your computer can handle the files. The next thing we want to look at is the shooting mode. So do we want to shoot full automatic, or do we want to start moving into more of automatic settings for video? And there's a number of different pros and cons here. So automatic, yes, it's easy. You hit that red button on the back of your housing. Pretty much every housing from compact to mirrorless to DSLR will have that red video record button. So if you're a photographer or new to shooting underwater in general, just hit that red button and you're going to start recording great video. Once you start looking at specific effects and wanting to control things like your bokeh and your depth of field, then that's something where we're going to start wanting to use manual settings. So if we want to use partial manual settings, I look at those as time value or shutter priority, or also aperture value priority. So with both of those, you're choosing one exposure variable and then letting the camera meter the scene and expose for the other exposure variable. Now, one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that your shutter speed generally wants to double your frame rate. So, yeah, I know. So frame rate is essentially the number of still images being showed within a second to create that movie. You know, a movie is a series of still photos at a certain frames per second that are producing a movie. So if you go to the theater, you'll probably see a lot of movies shot in 24 frames per second. A lot of the stuff we're doing digitally is 30 frames per second or even 60 frames per second. And then what happens is as you increase the frames per second, you can slow that back down when you're working to create really smooth slow motion. So essentially, if you're shooting at 60 frames per second and then you're editing a final video at 30 frames per second, you can reduce 60 frames per second in half. So when half speed or when half slow motion, in order to produce slow motion video and not have any chunky slow motion. It'll look very smooth because even when reducing the time by half, you have enough frames to fill in that 30 frames per second. And it'll take twice as long to show because it's moving at half the speed. So that's pretty interesting. So taking that back to shutter priority or time value priority, we want to make sure that shutter speed in our setting is double the frame rate. So if we're shooting at 30 frames per second, we want our shutter speed to be 1/60th of a second. So if you're using time value, set your time value at 1/60th of a second and let the camera determine the aperture based on what you're shooting. If you're shooting an aperture priority, which I generally don't recommend for video, you would want to set your aperture for the intended depth of field and adjust the lighting to make sure that your shutter speed is staying over 1/60th of a second. Again, I wouldn't recommend that. I would stick with time value if you're shooting something where you're going to have a lot of exposure changes. So think about maybe shooting dolphins or whales in the ocean where you're swinging around like this, or maybe manta rays at a cleaning station where you have a lot of changes to the sunlight, your exposure is changing. That's when that time value setting might make sense, or even going all the way back to automatic. So for manual shooting, we want to also look at those same theories as we use for time value shooting. So we want to have our shutter speed double the frames per second that we're shooting at. So if our frames per second are 30 FPS, then we'll shoot at 1/60th of a second. If we're shooting at 60 frames per second, because maybe we want to do some slow motion when we're editing, then we want our shutter speed to be 1/125th of a second. So you always want to have your shutter speed when you're shooting double that frames per second rate. Now, once we start looking at the aperture, we also have the ISO. These are our two other exposure variables. So get your video lights on, you can determine a nice ISO you want to use, and then use your aperture to step down to create enough depth of field for the subject you're shooting. More depth of field might also help darken the ambient light and create more of a black background. So it could be really useful for macro. The ISO is going to be a big variable because we want to bump that ISO to ensure we have enough light to stop down with our aperture to create that depth of field. So we've got those variables there, and this is one of those times where I say brighter video lights are better because the more light we have, the lower we can keep our ISO while stopping down the aperture to create enough depth of field so that we don't have shallow depth of field like in this shot right here. Underwater lighting. So this is very much the same thing as strobe positioning and our strobe angles of light. So if you've watched my strobe positioning tutorials, use the exact same techniques to light the subject. You might want a key light with a fill light to help produce softer shadows. You might want lighting from the front, from the side, macro, wide angle, but definitely check out those angles. It's the same thing. One of the really nice aspects of underwater video is that you're minimizing backscatter to begin with. So whereas a still photo will freeze all those spots of backscatter, with video, those spots are going to be moving through the frame and less apparent. So you do have a little more leeway with light positioning and backscatter because you won't see it as much in the frame. That said, do keep an eye on it because minimizing backscatter will produce that better video. One big tip for underwater video is to try and be as stable as possible. I'm sure we've all seen shots that are very shaky, and here's a subject, someone swimming after a fish or something like that. Even something like a selfie stick that's bobbing around a little bit. Try and keep your video as stable as possible, and that's going to produce great shots. Be very conscious when you're shooting your video to keep the camera as stable, even by minimizing movement, because that's going to help your autofocus as well. And a still shot is going to look much better than a panning shot that's got some wobble in it. So keep that in mind as you're shooting and try and get as consciously stable as possible when you're shooting video, and you'll be rewarded with a lot better shots that you can edit and work with. The last tip is for those who are shooting a video with the intent to edit. So whether you have a storyboard you're working off of, or whether you're just running and gunning, what you want to do is make sure you have handles at the edge of each clip. And what I mean by that is you want extra video before and after the piece of the clip that you want to use when editing. And the reason for that is because that gives us some room to create transitions, whether it's dip to black or whether it's some sort of crossfade. You want that extra footage to be able to create those creative transitions when you're editing. If you don't have those handles, you'll run into a lot of problem when you're trying to create those creative transitions. So you'll see that I've got some samples of the handles in this editing sequence, and that's really what you want to go for. You want to always make sure you've got that extra buffer between the action of the frame. So that's pretty much it. I hope this was useful for you guys and that you get out and start shooting some video. If you have more questions on video, if you're a video shooter and have specific topics you want to dive in depth on, shoot me an email and we'll do that. See you guys for the next video.